Welcome to our Facebook Live, where UC Davis health experts provide information that you want to know. I'm Pamela Wu. We're going to be discussing autism and sensory stimuli today. Some people with autism spectrum disorder are hypersensitive to bright lights or certain sights, sounds, smells, feels, and touch, while others have a low sensitivity to pain or to the body signals that control balance. We're going to be discussing new research in this area with faculty members of the UC Davis Mind Institute and a graduate student who's also autistic and can share his personal experience. I have three guests with me today virtually. They are Dr. Susan Rivera, professor and chair of the Department of Psychology at UC Davis; Clifford Saron, research scientist and faculty member at the Center for Mind and Brain; Patrick Dwyer, who identifies as an autistic person who is researching autism as a psychology graduate student. Doctors Rivera and Saron and Patrick, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Happy to be here.
Absolutely. And to our viewers, if you have questions today, please feel free to post them in the comments. We will answer them as we can toward the end of the discussion. I'd love to start with the first person perspective here. Patrick, as an adult with autism, how do you experience and perceive the world when it comes to sensory input?
Yeah, so first of all, my experience is just one autistic person's experience. So as you were saying earlier, a lot of autistic people have different kinds of sensory experiences. There's some people who might be undersensitive to certain stimuli, people who are really interested in and fascinated by pleasurable aspects of stimuli. There's people who are really aggravated by annoying sounds, like people chewing, far more so than neurotypical people would be. People who get really distracted by sounds in the background when they're like trying to take a test, like air conditioning and so on. But for me, I would say that the most impactful sort of sensory experiences that I've been having are sensory overloads in response to really intense stimuli, loud sounds, big crowds, that sort of thing. And it's kind of hard to describe this experience. The English language honestly doesn't have the right terms, I'm afraid, but I really do come back to that idea of overload, of being overwhelmed by the experience of it being too much to function and cope. So it can be really impactful. Other people talk about pain and headaches and stuff, but I basically had to leave the mainstream middle school because of this. Other people dropping college classes, quitting jobs because of these experiences. So they could be really impactful.
What advice do you have for other people with autism who are dealing with similar challenges? When you talk about it with other people who have autism, what sort of advice do you have? What exchanges do you have?
Yeah, so I mean, it really depends on what specific sort of sensory challenges somebody is going through. So for example, I mentioned earlier, some people have these sensory aggravations, sounds like chewing and so on can be really annoying. Well, there, I think exposing yourself gently to the stimuli in a safe way can actually be helpful and help you tolerate it better. Whereas if you have something like sensory overload to some of these intense sounds that I was talking about earlier, the sort of thing I was saying I have experienced, I think it's actually often very counterproductive, ends up making everything worse if you're stressing yourself out and causing anxiety through repeated exposure and making everything worse. I do think that things like noise canceling headphones and earplugs could be very useful, not 24/7, but for specific circumstances where there's going to be sensory triggers to help you sleep, that sort of thing. I could go on, but we could talk for a very long time if I did, so.
It's a really, really interesting topic. And I know that as scholars, this is why the three of you are looking into it to better understand this diversity of sensory processing, these different kinds that Patrick mentioned. I know you recently published a paper looking at how brains of different children on the autism spectrum respond to sounds. I'm interested in knowing just how you studied that. And Dr. Rivera, let's begin with you.
Sure. So first I'll say that back when we originally designed this experiment and ones like it, it was very much the norm in autism research to really almost focus exclusively on social deficits or social differences in aspects of autism. But we have, from the beginning, Cliff and I, who sort of found each other when we came to UC Davis, been really interested in basic sensory processing. So how those with autism actually see, sense sights, sounds, feelings in the world. around them, and how those differences and just perceiving things in the world could lead to the kinds of things that Patrick was just talking about. So we started to design experiments like the ones that we're going to talk about today. This specific one that you referred to was an experiment with a very simple design. We were delivering sounds of varying decibel levels, varying intensity levels to kids over headphones. And so 50, 60, 70, 80 decibel levels. And that goes from fairly soft to loud, but not too painfully loud. And we did this while recording electrical currents on the scalp using EEG. And importantly, for this kind of experiment, we don't need any kind of overt response from the children. So they can just, all we're interested in how their brains respond.
Wow.
So they can just sit and listen while they're doing something they want to do. In the case of the way we set it up, we set it up so that they can listen to these sounds while watching a low volume movie of their choice. And by doing it this way, we can get a real multitude of trials in every one of these decibel levels. So it allows us to see how their brains respond to differing auditory loudness.
That is so interesting. Dr. Saron, can you weigh in too on some of the methods used?
Sure. So one of the remarkable things that it's possible to do when you have many repeated instances of a stimulus of a certain kind, like a quiet or a loud sound, is that you can, when you're recording brain electrical activity from a cap on the head, you can actually measure an extremely small perturbation of ongoing brain electrical activity. If you repeatedly stimulate the person with the stimulus, and then you average together these very slight perturbations of the ongoing brain electrical activity. And we call these averaged responses event-related potentials. And there's a whole world of research in neuroscience that seeks to understand brain processing with respect to many different aspects of perception, cognition, and motor response using these very tiny electrical signals. The brain waves that we record on the surface of the scalp are about 150,000 times weaker than a single little flashlight battery. So we're talking about a remarkable technology. And because Susan brought to our team this expertise in working with children moment to moment, we designed an experiment that most people would think would not be possible. We were able to keep very young children in the laboratory hooked up and record literally between 800 and 1,500 brain responses to these stimuli. And that lets us, for each individual person, have a nice set of event-related potentials to analyze with respect to other characteristics about each person.
Wow, that's so amazing. It makes me really eager to hear about the results. Dr. Rivera, what did you find?
So in one study that we used this experiment, we were really looking at what became part of our proposal for our UC Davis Mind Institute Autism Center for Excellence grant. We recorded the brainwaves, just as Cliff was talking about, and compared autistic children who were of two groups. Some who had unusually large head size for their height. We call it disproportionate megalencephaly, or DM. And then kids with autism who did not have unusually large head size, and compared those to typically developing kids. And we found that the brain responses for the big-brained group were different, and that in fact they represent sort of a subgroup of autism. And this work was really dovetailed with previous work at the Mind Institute, finding that kids with these big brains, which is about 15% of boys with autism, we think, really have a different outcome and different prognosis. So it's really a subphenotype of autism that we were looking at. And besides this work, Patrick has also been looking at data from this large sample of many, many toddlers that we collected this data from, and using cluster-based analyses. Patrick, do you want to talk about what you found in some of the cluster-based analyses?
Certainly. So it's kind of the exact opposite approach with the same data to what Dr. Rivera was just talking about, because now instead of taking this pre-existing group, people with big brains and normal sized brains, we're instead allowing the brain responses to kind of sort themselves into different categories of people with similar brain responses. And we actually found a huge diversity in this very large sample of young kids. Some people were actually showing a stronger brain response to soft sounds than to loud sounds, which is really counterintuitive. And we are seeing these patterns in both autistic and typically developing participants. So a lot of diversity in both groups. And one really interesting finding came from a subgroup of participants who were disproportionately hyper responsive to the very, very loudest sounds, even more than you'd expect just on the basis of the sounds being loud. And in autistic participants specifically, this hyper responsiveness to these very loud sounds was actually related to problems with sensory processing reported by the children's parents in daily life. Parents said that these kids were the ones who had the biggest problems with auditory filtering in daily life. They're actually linking the brain and everyday behavior.
Given these findings, then, what are the implications for helping children with autism deal with these challenges, like in their day-to-day lives?
Should I take that one?
Sure.
All right. So I think, first of all, one major thing is we are actually seeing that there is something different going on in the brains of some of these autistic participants. And that's important because I know in my own experience, I'm not always believed when I say that my brain processes sensory stimuli quite a bit differently from other people. So we're actually providing some data to say that, no, you should actually listen to people when they say this. Another key finding is that we are seeing this huge diversity. So I don't know I can necessarily say, well, here's a one size fits all solution for a set of accommodations or supports that will fit everybody. But I think it's really important to listen to the sensory experiences described by each person, or if they aren't able to communicate those experiences, to really look at the sensory behaviors and the sensory reactions with an open mind and empathy for the point of view of the autistic person, try and figure out what experience they are having. And then from there, you're able to figure out, okay, what sort of supports and accommodations we can provide.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. If I could just follow up on that. I mean, I think Patrick hit the nail on the head. I think we have tended as a field to really think about these as binary categories, right? Here's the way the brains of people with autism behave, and these are the ways of the brains of people with typically development behave, but it's not like that. So we see so much heterogeneity in both of those categories that it's really important to say one autistic brain may behave in this way, another autistic brain may actually process those sensory stimuli in a very different way. So that very personalized approach, I think, should carry through to our therapeutic plans as well.
If I can further
Please.
chime in, I think both what Patrick and Susan said are really incredibly important. And one of the questions you asked, Pamela, was how can we help individuals with autism? And one way to move forward on that is to actually consider the family system and the institutional setting as absolutely part and parcel of the world of the child that we're talking about. And so it's really difficult to have an intuitive sense of the fundamental certainty of experience of a person who experiences the world differently than you do. So you know that you can barely hear the sound of your computer fan, but someone else might experience it as they can't attend to anything else because that little quiet whir is now sounding like a very encompassing stimulus that is infinitely distracting. So in line with having empathy, there's also this more even grounded, like their experience is fundamentally as valid an understanding of reality as your experiences if you happen to be neurotypical. And, you know, you can sometimes even clue this in, as Susan was talking about, regarding heterogeneity of everyone. Maybe sometimes you can notice your spouse or a loved one doesn't experience a taste the same way, or doesn't see, you know, the shimmer of a reflection on a puddle the same way, and it doesn't stop walking because they're attending to something else. So what becomes salient, what really becomes the thing that grabs your mind, grabs your attention in any given unfolding context, can be vastly different person to person. So what it takes to impute the world of another is an immense commitment to knowing each other through what could be described as a kind of active love to inquire about their first person subjective experience.
And if I can sneak in a few more sentences, I'm sorry, just building on Cliff's such an important, eloquent point. We also have to then show some flexibility. As a field, autism researchers are very fond of saying that autistic people are inflexible and rigid, and I acknowledge we can be stubborn and annoying at times, but our society is so inflexible and rigid at times. Mm-hmm. There's very often some simple accommodations and changes that we can put in place in order to make the experience of the world so much more tolerable.
Tolerance is really, I think, such a key word here. I feel like those who go through these experiences, and listening to you talk about it, the word anxiety really comes to mind. It's anxious to experience the stressor. It's anxiety inducing to have people around you not understand it. And then I think one of the words that Clifford used was this sort of like invalidation, and then also I think to justify one's position as well. I know that you've recently published a paper about the impact of anxiety on this experience. Did all three of you contribute to this scholarship? So let's talk about that. And Patrick, maybe I'll begin with you.
Sure. Yeah, so this is something that autistic people have been talking about for a long time, how anxiety and the sensory experience can be so intimately intertwined. When I was in middle school, I had these negative sensory experiences, and of course I was anxious about the next sensory stimulus, which meant that I was constantly scanning my environment looking, oh, where's the next threatening sensory stimulus going to come from? So that made me so much more anxious, and the sensory experience so much worse, and then that nasty sensory experience made the anxiety even worse, and then it just gets into this vicious spiral. So what we did is we looked back at those parent reports of the sensory behaviors that I mentioned earlier, and we let those group themselves into categories, and we found that the autistic children who had the greatest sensory problems, the most intense sensory phenotypes, those were actually people who did have more anxiety in their daily lives, and that's very consistent with prior research as well as what autistic people have been saying.
How important is it for us to understand that aspect of the issue?
I think it is really important because we often don't recognize just how much, the context that we're in beyond the sensory stimulus itself shapes the experience. How much control we have over the sensory stimulus really shapes the experience, how stressed we are, how tired we are, how anxious we are. And if we understand these things, we can really change the sensory experience. So because I knew that I was in this vicious cycle where constant exposure was giving me this worsening sensory trajectory, I was able to remove myself from that environment. And then suddenly I was better able, ironically, to cope with the very sensory stimuli that I was now no longer being exposed to all the time. And unfortunately, we don't have a huge amount of research about that. We did look at this trajectory of changes over time, at least from preschool to school age, and we did see that there was a small subgroup of individuals whose sensory problems actually got worse while most other people stayed the same. But we really need to do further work of that kind over a longer period of time to see what's going on in older individuals over time.
I would just like to add one quick thing you mentioned, Pamela, the word tolerance. I think it needs to be tolerance shared with interest and curiosity, because it's an active inquiry to try to suss out what the world is like for someone with autism if you're neurotypical. And, you know, it's really an important effort to come with gentleness and real desire for inquiry by engaging a person and saying, well, how is that for you? Because I see you just had this reaction. Could you tell me, you know, like draw or tell me something about that? Or, you know, however you can take the temperature of that situation down by either moving to a physically quieter place, but also after a moment of upset is gone, really inquire, how was that for you? Because I don't have that experience. You need to educate me. So parents need to develop theories of mind of their children.
And I would add that that's even harder when you have children who are minimally verbal. So where they can't just respond to a question, how was that for you? So that's a lot of work comes into in trying to intuit the sensory experiences of a child who can't tell you how they're feeling. So it's very, very important to do more work around this, both on the therapeutic side of things, on the parenting side of things, but just as humans understanding one another. So it's really a lot of, you know, sort of ground to be made up here. But I think starting with just some of this basic science that shows us their brains are actually processing the world differently. How would that translate to different behavior? And how do we make that something that's okay and we help to accommodate it?
Such great advice on, yes, tolerance, but also understanding and active engagement too, to be a part of the conversation. We're discussing how people on the autism spectrum process sensory stimuli and experience the world. Our guests today are Dr. Susan Rivera, Dr. Clifford Saron, and Patrick Dwyer. If you have questions, please post them in the comments and we'll answer them toward the end of the discussion. I see we have one that I look forward to having you answer. But first, we've been talking about loudness a lot, and I know that the three of you have also worked on a study on more than just auditory stimuli. Can you please describe that? Susan, let's begin with you.
Sure. We have in our multi-sensory integration experiment, Cliff and I got our mad scientist capes on and had a lot of fun building a sensory desktop that allowed us to deliver visual, auditory, and somatosensory, so a little bump to the finger, stimuli to children in the same sort of binding domain. So it had this little desktop where they put their hand and they could see, hear, and feel stimuli. And we could deliver those stimuli separately, so just visual, just auditory, just somatosensory, or in any combination. So we had unimodal, bimodal, and trimodal sensory stimulation. And that experiment was designed to tell us how the brain would deal with sensory information from more than one sensory modality, and at the same time or in isolation, and to discover the differences between how this is handled by the autistic brain versus the typically developing brain. So that's the background of the experiment.
Cliff, do you have more to add?
Well, you know, I think most people experience a unified world where sight, sound, touch, you know, if you take a coffee cup and you put it down on your desk, you feel through your fingers the sensation of the movement, you hear the sound, and you see the cup, all happening sort of roughly simultaneously as an integrated experience. From the neuroscientific point of view, you have extraordinarily different streams of information that are coming to your brain and body and your sense organs simultaneously. And our brains are building this unified experience of the world by integrating these different sensory systems. And if there isn't extremely precise integration, or one modality takes precedence over another, an enormous amount of the experience of this unified, predictable, sensical world that most people experience gets lost. And so trying to investigate this process of integrating sensory information from more than one modality is another way in to investigating the different sensory experience of the world for people with autism. That's the larger sort of overarching point of the study.
Patrick, can you share with us what was found in terms of results?
Sure, sure. So as far as the brain results are concerned, we were again getting those brain waves and making these averaged event-related potentials like Cliff was talking about earlier. And we're doing that both for these stimuli in one modality, like auditory stimuli alone, and also for these multimodal simultaneous stimuli. And then we're taking those alone stimuli, like auditory and visual stimuli, the responses to those, and adding those together, and then comparing them to the responses to those same stimuli presented simultaneously. And the idea is that if you're processing them not strictly in parallel, but in an integrated way, like Cliff was just talking about, then the response to that sum of the alone events should be different from the simultaneous. That would show that there's some integration. It's not strictly parallel and separate. And what we actually find is, again, there's individual variability, but overall, on average, autistic participants did show less audiovisual integration, which is very consistent with a lot of autistic people who describe, not all, but a lot of us who describe single channel processing, that if we're attending to something in one sensory modality like hearing, then it's perhaps hard to focus on vision, for example. And as Cliff was saying, this is hugely important in daily life. We think it could be important in language learning when you're a young kid. If you're trying to learn spoken language, you'll need to be able to coordinate what you're hearing with what you're seeing, or just in everyday social interactions when, you know, right now, everybody who's watching this is both hearing me talk, and you're also seeing some of my gestures, my lips moving, all of that, hopefully in sync. I don't know with this technology sometimes. So that's, you know, I think very important.
I understand that you are also currently working on a study of hyperfocus in autism, the ability or tendency of a person to sort of like zero in on one task or interest and oftentimes excel at it as well. What can you tell us about that?
Right, so this is actually a whole theory of autism, this idea of monotropism, that this intense, narrowly focused attentional processing is sort of in some way at the core of what it means to be autistic. And this is, I think, probably the only major theory of autism to have been developed by autistic people, not me specifically, other autistic people. And it's an idea that really intrigues me because I do have this sort of consciousness myself of having this intense focus very often, both in positive ways. So I often have these intense interests that I enjoy focusing on, and I get into what we sort of call a flow state where the rest of the world is fading, and I'm really in what I'm doing. It's great. But it also can have its downsides because I think perhaps the same sort of hyper-focused attention, maybe that's being captured by some of these unpleasant stimuli out of the environment, and maybe that's causing some of these experiences of overload and sensory aggravation and all these other kinds of unpleasant sensory experiences. So we're hoping to both verify that yes, there is this hyper-focused attention in autism, and also to see how it's related to these sensory experiences.
We are beginning to receive some questions from the audience, some really good ones too. The first one asks, what are ways to help work around the overstimulus and live a regular day-to-day life? So this is, I think, regarding, you know, some practical tips and advice. So I welcome any and all of you to jump in.
I'm going to jump in first and sort of ask a question. Well, what does it mean to have a regular day-to-day life? I think that's a really good question. I have a life that, I think is a fairly fulfilled one. I'm mentally healthy. I enjoy the research that I do on a day-to-day basis. I enjoy my life. It is also not a strictly regular life. I would never, even before COVID, go out to like a really noisy bar or restaurant or something. I avoid certain environments. I try and structure my day so that I'm not constantly exposed to negative sensory stimuli. I eat a balanced diet, but I avoid foods that I really dislike because I do have some sensory dislikes, and that works for me. So I live a fulfilled life, whether it's like the same life a neurotypical person would have, I don't know, but I'm happy with it.
And I think I would add in terms of, let's say, parents who might be thinking about reducing some of that for their children. It's really key, I think, as we've learned over the years and looking at data like this, to think about the fact that everybody has their unique sensory experience. And there isn't one sort of normative way to sort of, approach the world. And we have to start to learn to accommodate, to help those children accommodate to what they need. What can make them live their best life? What can make them perform at their most fulfilling level? And that's going to include acknowledging that we don't just need to change them into not being affected this way, right? If they have sensory sensitivities, we instead need to figure out what needs to be changed in their environment to have them be able to perform at their optimal level and have their optimal well-being. So I think it's a really sort of different way of approaching therapeutics, approaching thinking about sensory sensitivities, rather than saying we need to get rid of them, which, by and large has been found not to be completely possible. Rather, how can we accommodate them and how can we help that person, be it a child or an adult, really get where they need to be so that they can be functionally happy the way that Patrick described.
Yeah, I think that one of I had the same question that Patrick raised about what is a normal life. And particularly over the last 8 months, we've all learned about how adaptable we are. It admits tremendous suffering and inequities and real unfortunate outcomes in terms of what we're doing. But at the same time, there is a change in lifestyle that we have accommodated to. And within that accommodation, there is tremendous vitality and creativity and capacity for connection, even through Zoom. You can take this little, micro example and extend it to the influence of what is taken to be normative through our culture and deconstruct it and really say, this person should flourish in the ways the world can allow them to flourish, rather than this molding them to the world as it is. And I think that as part of that process, parents and family members are going to naturally worry, what does this mean for their future? And so then you get familial anxiety that is already a contagion for the anxiety that's being provoked by the mismatch in the experience of the child. And, I'm a parent of someone who had significant sensory challenges growing up, who's now a thriving and fully wonderful 27-year-old. And I talked to him about this Facebook Live. And I said, what would you say to this group? And he said, let your child fumble around, make mistakes, come to their own understanding of how things are, and not make them wrong for what is their reality.
Really powerful words from someone who's experienced this.
Mm-hmm.
We have a follow-up to that question. It asks, to expand, can you give examples on ways to make a typical school day less filled with anxiety?
Oh gosh, that's a tricky one. And remember what I said, that in my case it got so bad I had to like leave and be homeschooled for years and years. But there were things we tried before then that helped. It wasn't quite enough in my case, but I know a lot of people who've been able to thrive in mainstream schools with all the bustle and noise. So one thing we did try was, I would leave class a few minutes early. I got special permission to do that. I walked through the hallways when there weren't, hundreds or thousands of other people all pouring through at the same time. I got exemptions that I didn't have to eat my food in a noisy, busy cafeteria with everybody else. So there are a lot of, ways that we can be flexible and try and, while recognizing that there's limitations, it is an environment that's inherently quite busy. There's ways that we can protect ourselves from the worst of that.
More advice on ways to make a school day less filled with anxiety? I mean, school now too is over Zoom largely as well. So that complicates things too.
It complicates things for some. It resolves problems for others. So some are finding it, easier. Many are finding it much harder. So I think that, of course, Patrick would have the best advice with the first person experience. But the general tenet of just meeting the child where they are, being very attuned and sensitive to what it is they need, and it's going to be different for every child. So not thinking, even as a school administrator or as someone who puts together IEPs or whatever your role may be, not making the mistake of thinking everyone will need the same accommodation is really important as well.
Yeah. One thing that, oh, sorry, Cliff, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to add a further thought that, one thing that I did run into is people were saying, well, why is it that Patrick is having to leave this sensory environment and not that one? Because, that one's technically objectively noisier, but there's just, as I mentioned before, so many contextual factors that shape these experiences. So, you really do have to accept that sometimes sensory processing is difficult to understand, and we just have to roll with it. And if you are like on the verge of a sensory meltdown or something, I hope this goes without saying, but obviously you want to remove yourself from that environment. So really, if you can advocate for the schools to get an exemption so that you can like leave if you're about to explode, that would be highly advisable.
Yeah, I was just going to harken back to some some elementary school experience where our son was extremely sensitive to smells and would gag and potentially even vomit in response to someone in the classroom having a tuna fish sandwich. And so every lunchtime became, a scary thing when everybody is having fun and enjoying their food. He's worrying about, what's going to happen to the smells that waft his way. So a simple accommodation is to simply always open a window near where he is and have him by the window. Same for the sound of the ventilation, move that person up so they hear the teacher, and then, explain to the other students that this is an important thing for their ability to understand what's happening. There's so many micro accommodations that can happen that just have to come to the awareness of people with the ability to make even a small change that can make a huge difference. And this, we didn't go out for breakfast for, I think, 4 years because the smell of eggs had the same consequence. And that was like, fine. And so I think it's that's fine is the real where the body is buried. It's fine.
That seems to be it for audience questions at this point, although I encourage members of our audience to continue to post questions in the comments, even upon like later viewings on Facebook, to the recording, because we will continue to get those questions to our experts so that they can be answered for you. Before we go, Dr. Rivera, would you like to tell us a bit about the upcoming Neurodiversity Summit?
Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity, Pamela. And I think it's really timely because it follows up really nicely to the things that we've been talking about. So this term neurodiversity sort of referring to the diversity of human brains and thought and cognitive functioning, found across the species, really. And it's really sort of developed in the autistic community, but it's also really not just about autism. It's about honoring the full spectrum of human neurocognitive variation. So Patrick and I are co-organizing the second of our UC Davis Neurodiversity Summits, and it's coming up not this Friday, but the next, November 20th. And we really invite people to join us. It's of course free, of course virtual, and we will have really, really exciting discussions, panel discussions about education, about behavior intervention, a dialogue between experts on both sides of the sort of good and bad of behavior intervention, talk about cross-disability alliances, and so including people with autism into research, into everyday sort of interactions, and talk about autistic burnout. So it's going to be a really great lineup. And thanks for the opportunity to let people know about it. You can go to the Mind Institute website, also the Center for Mind and Brain website, and the UC Davis Psychology website. Any of those will allow you to click and register to join us on November 20th.
November 20th. So that's just 10 days from now.
Just 10 days from now, yes. And it starts at about 9 a.m. and it'll go for until about noon, so about half a day.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much. Dr. Susan Rivera, Dr. Clifford Saron, and Patrick Dwyer, thanks for sharing this incredible knowledge with us. Appreciate it so much.
Really
For
appreciate
giving us the opportunity.
Indeed.
Thank you so much.
And thank you as well to our viewing audience for joining us for this UC Davis Health Facebook Live. We will, as Dr. Rivera said, share information about web links that you can visit to learn more about today's topic and the Neurodiversity Summit. Those will be posted in the comments on this broadcast. We also, of course, encourage you to share this post if you have family and friends who you think would enjoy learning from it. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll see you next time.